Elliot Harris had spent another uneventful evening in his dimly lit workshop, surrounded by a tangle of wires, tools, and half-finished projects that seemed more like companions than mere objects. He preferred the solitude, the predictable hum of his machines, and the satisfying click of solder-on circuits. The world outside his workshop could be chaotic, filled with expectations he could never quite meet. Here, he was in control until that night. A thunderous sound split the air, shattering the tranquility. The ground shuddered, and the hum of his machines flickered to silence. Elliot froze, his eyes darting toward the window. Outside, the night sky blazed with a peculiar light, its hues shifting between green and gold, streaking downward toward the woods behind his property. A crash echoed moments later, sending a plume of smoke curling upward into the stars. Curiosity prickled at the back of his neck, urging him to move. Grabbing a flashlight, he stepped into the chilly air, his breath forming pale clouds. The forest loomed dark and silent save for the distant crackle of fire. Each step into the woods heightened his unease, the beam of his flashlight catching nothing but tangled roots and damp leaves. Then he saw it. Nestled in a smoldering crater was something otherworldly. The object, sleek and silver, shimmered faintly as if it were alive. Its surface was seamless, unmarred by rivets or seams, glowing faintly with an iridescent sheen. The vessel was unlike anything Elliot had ever seen. His heart pounded as he approached, torn between awe and the irrational urge to run. The vessel hissed softly, a subtle noise that made his pulse quicken. Before he could fully process the sight, the ship's smooth surface rippled like water, and a panel slid open with an unnatural hiss. A figure emerged, stumbling onto the ground with a grace that faltered as soon as it touched earth. The figure rose, revealing a humanoid shape cloaked in a strange, luminous suit. Elliot's breath caught as the figure turned toward him, its face becoming visible in the light. She was unlike anything he had ever imagined. Her skin gleamed faintly, a soft blue hue that caught the moonlight, and her silver hair moved as if alive. Her eyes, impossibly large and glowing faintly, locked onto his with a sharp intensity that sent a shiver through him. She staggered, one hand clutching her side, and spoke a single word in a voice that was both melodic and commanding. Warm. Elliot blinked, unsure if he'd misheard, but before he could respond, she crumpled to the ground. Her body hit the dirt with a dull thud, and for a moment all he could do was stare. The ship, the crash, the woman, it was too much. But as the seconds ticked by and her shallow breathing reached his ears, something inside him stirred. Against his better judgment, he stepped closer. Her skin was icy to the touch, the kind of cold that made him instinctively pull back. But the faint rise and fall of her chest spurred him into action. He shrugged off his jacket and draped it over her, hoping it might help. Her eyes fluttered open for a moment, meeting his with a look that was equal parts desperate and piercing. "Help me," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Fix. Shit." Elliot hesitated. Logic screamed at him to walk away, to call someone, anyone better equipped to deal with whatever this was. But something about the vulnerability in her expression, the raw plea beneath her regal bearing, made it impossible to leave her there. He managed to carry her back to his workshop, her weight surprisingly light despite her height. She stirred faintly as he set her down on the old leather couch he used for the rare moments he took breaks. Her breathing was shallow, her skin alarmingly cold. He rummaged through his drawers for anything that might help, his mind racing, blankets, heat, anything. When she finally stirred, her voice was stronger but no less commanding. She introduced herself as Lyra, Princess of Zeltherion, a planet of ice and unyielding traditions. Her words were clipped, her sentences laced with an air of superiority, even as she explained the predicament she was in. Sabotage, betrayal, and a crash landing on a primitive planet she clearly deemed beneath her. Elliot worked on her ship as she instructed, his skepticism growing with every detail of her story. Yet, the undeniable technology in front of him and her otherworldly presence quashed any doubt. She was alien, there was no denying it. And yet there was something strikingly human in her frustration when he didn't move fast enough, in the way her shoulders sagged ever so slightly when she thought he wasn't looking. By the time the night deepened, her condition worsened. She trembled violently, her breath shallow. Elliot offered more blankets, turned on the workshop's heater, even tried hot water bottles, but nothing worked. Finally, her glowing eyes met his, her voice trembling as she grasped his wrist. "You," she said, her fingers like ice against his skin. "You are warm." Elliot recoiled instinctively, but the desperation in her gaze held him captive. Her words barely made sense, but he couldn't deny the truth of her condition. Resigned, he sat beside her on the couch, letting her lean against him. Her head rested lightly on his shoulder, her shivering gradually subsiding as his warmth seemed to steady her. The closeness was unnerving, her presence both alien and oddly familiar. Her breathing evened out, her tension melting away as exhaustion claimed her. Elliot sat there, staring at the ceiling, his mind racing with questions he couldn't begin to answer. Who was she, really? What was he getting himself into? When dawn broke, she was stronger, her commanding presence returning as if the vulnerability of the night had never happened. She stood, regal despite the disheveled state of her clothing, and issued her demands with a tone that brooked no argument. But something had shifted. In the quiet moments of the night, in the fragile trust forged by necessity, a connection had been formed. Fragile, unspoken, but undeniable. And as Elliot picked up his tools to continue repairing her ship, he couldn't shake the feeling that his life would never be the same again. The morning sunlight filtered through the workshop's grimy windows, casting pale golden streaks across the cluttered floor. Elliot moved between his tools and the half-disassembled pieces of Lyra's damaged ship, his hands working automatically while his mind churned with unease. He'd slept for less than an hour, his thoughts too tangled with questions he couldn't answer and a presence he couldn't ignore. Lyra had recovered enough to pace the room like a restless predator, her luminous eyes flicking between him and her battered vessel with a mixture of impatience and disdain. "You're slow," she remarked, her voice cutting through the silence like a blade. "Are all humans this inefficient, or is it a trait unique to you?" Elliot didn't look up, focusing instead on the delicate alien circuitry under his hands. He'd decided early on that arguing with her was a waste of time. "Maybe if you explained what half of this stuff does, I'd be faster," he muttered, the edge in his tone more a shield than a weapon. "I'm not exactly fluent in alien tech," Lyra scoffed, but didn't respond. She stood beside the ship, her fingers grazing the edge of the hull as though she could will it to repair itself. Her posture was regal, every line of her body radiating an authority that Elliot found both infuriating and strangely compelling. He didn't know whether to resent her or admire her. Maybe it was both. The tension between them simmered like a pot about to boil over. Every time she gave an order, Elliot felt his temper flare, but he bit it back, channeling his frustration into his work. She, in turn, seemed to take his defiance as a personal affront, her sharp remarks growing more pointed with each passing hour. And yet, there were moments fleeting and unspoken when their eyes met, and something softer flickered between them. A truce, fragile and temporary, born out of necessity. By midday, Elliot stepped back from the ship, wiping sweat from his brow. "I've done what I can with the tools I have," he said, his voice laced with exhaustion. "If you want more, you'll need to let me get parts from town." Lyra's gaze snapped to him, sharp and suspicious, "and risk exposing my presence to your kind." "Do you think I am a fool?" Elliot sighed, pinching the bridge of his nose. "I'm not planning to throw you a parade. But unless you've got spare hyperdrives hidden under your couch, I don't see another option." She hesitated, her fingers tightening around the edge of the ship's hull. The vulnerability he'd glimpsed the night before resurfaced, a crack in her otherwise unyielding exterior. "If they find me," she said softly, "they will not show mercy. And neither will your people. Then we'll keep them from finding you," Elliot said, surprising himself with the conviction in his voice. He didn't know why he cared. Maybe it was the way she tried to mask her fear with bravado, or maybe it was just the kind of person he was. Either way, the words hung between them, an unspoken promise. Reluctantly, Lyra nodded, though her distrust was evident in the way she watched him as he gathered supplies. He left her with a stern warning to stay out of sight, knowing full well she'd do whatever she pleased. As he drove into town, the familiar streets and faces seemed surreal, as though he'd crossed into some parallel version of his own life. How could everything feel so normal when his world had been turned upside down? He returned hours later with a box of parts and a sense of foreboding he couldn't shake. The workshop was eerily quiet, the air heavy with attention he couldn't place. "Lyra," he called, setting the box down. No response. Panic flared briefly before he spotted her standing by the window, her expression unreadable as she stared into the distance. "They're coming," she said, her voice low and steady. Elliot's heart dropped. "Who's coming?" She turned to face him, her eyes burning with an intensity that made the hairs on the back of his neck stand on end. "The ones who sabotaged my ship. They'll stop at nothing to eliminate me." The words hung in the air like a death sentence. Before Elliot could respond, a distant rumble shook the ground, faint but unmistakable. He rushed to the door, peering out into the dusky evening. In the distance, a faint, unnatural light flickered through the trees. He turned back to Lyra, his mind racing. "We need to leave," he said, grabbing her arm. "If they find us here, there's no time," she interrupted, pulling away. "They're already here. The next moment's passed in a blur." The first attack came without warning. A streak of light that seared the air and exploded against the ground mere feet from the workshop. Elliot grabbed Lyra and pulled her behind the ship as more blasts rained down, the ground shaking with each impact. "They're targeting the ship," Lyra said, her voice tight with anger. "If they destroy it, I'm trapped here." Elliot didn't need her to explain the implications. He could see it in her eyes, the way her usual confidence was edged with desperation. Without thinking, he grabbed a wrench from his workbench and darted toward the ship, his heart pounding. He had no plan, no weapons, only the raw determination to protect the only person who could explain the chaos his life had become. The attackers emerged from the trees, their form shadowed and unfamiliar, their movements unnervingly precise. Elliot ducked behind the ship, his breath coming in short gasps. Lyra stood beside him, her hands glowing faintly as she muttered something in her native language. Before he could ask what she was doing, a burst of light shot from her palms, striking one of the figures and sending it sprawling. It wasn't enough. They were outnumbered, outgunned, and Elliot knew it. But as the battle raged, something shifted. Lyra's defenses faltered, her energy waning, and Elliot realized she couldn't hold them off alone. Gritting his teeth, he used the tools at his disposal, literally hurling wrenches and metal scraps to distract the attackers long enough for Lyra to regain her footing. When the dust finally settled, the clearing was silent once more. Lyra leaned heavily against the ship, her breathing ragged but steady. Elliot approached her cautiously, his hands trembling from the adrenaline. "Next time," he said, his voice strained, "maybe warn me before your enemies crash the party." To his surprise, Lyra managed a faint smile. It was brief, almost imperceptible, but it was enough to remind him that beneath the alien facade was someone who, despite everything, wasn't so different after all. As the last light of the day faded, they retreated to the workshop, both acutely aware that this was only the beginning. Night had fallen again, wrapping the forest in a heavy, oppressive silence broken only by the faint whir of tools as Elliot worked. The air inside the workshop felt different now, charged with a tension neither he nor Lyra acknowledged directly. They were a team out of necessity, each bound by circumstances they couldn't control. But Elliot felt the shift in their dynamic as keenly as the weight of the wrench in his hand. Lyra sat nearby, her back straight despite the exhaustion etched across her face. She had regained some of her regal composure after the attack, but the slight tremor in her hands as she adjusted a shard of damaged metal didn't escape Elliot's notice. She was tired, and for the first time, she looked uncertain, vulnerable. It was a strange contrast to her usual arrogance. "You're going to burn yourself out if you keep pushing like this," he said, not looking up from the alien circuit board he was trying to decode. "I don't have the luxury of rest," she replied, her voice sharp but softer than usual. "If I stop now, we'll lose any chance of repairing the ship before they return." You saw what they were capable of. Her words carried a weight that settled heavily between them. She was right. They had barely survived the first attack, and there was no guarantee they would be so lucky a second time. Elliot tightened a bolt, his fingers moving automatically as his mind churned. He wasn't used to this. The responsibility, the stakes, the knowledge that his actions or failures could mean life or death for someone else. "You're not invincible," he said after a pause, glancing over at her. "Even you need to breathe every once in a while." Lyra didn't respond immediately. Instead, she studied him, her glowing eyes narrowing slightly, as if weighing the truth of his words. Finally, she leaned back, the tension in her shoulders easing by the barest fraction. It was the closest thing to agreement he'd ever gotten from her, As the hours stretched on, they fell into a rhythm, working side by side in a silence that was almost companionable. Elliot found himself speaking without meaning to, his words spilling out into the quiet. "You know," he said, holding up a particularly stubborn piece of machinery, "this isn't exactly how I thought I'd be spending my week. Fixing alien tech while dodging space assassins wasn't on my to-do list." Lyra tilted her head, a flicker of amusement crossing her face. "And what was on your list?" Elliot snorted. "Pay the electric bill, maybe fix the sink in the kitchen. Nothing life-changing." Her lips twitched, the faintest hint of a smile ghosting across them before vanishing. It was a fleeting moment, but it stayed with Elliot longer than it should have. Their tentative truce was tested the next day when Lyra insisted on activating a core function of the ship's systems to test a repair. Elliot, ever cautious, argued that it was too soon, that they didn't know enough about the surrounding environment or how much power the ship could draw without drawing attention. "You underestimate my ship's capabilities," Lyra said, her tone tinged with exasperation. "And you underestimate how bad things could get if you light up a beacon for every UFO nut within 50 miles. Elliot shot back. The argument escalated, both of them too stubborn to back down. But just as Elliot was about to let his frustration boil over, Lyra faltered. Her gaze dropped to the floor, and her next words were quiet, almost inaudible. "I cannot fail." Elliot froze. The raw emotion in her voice was unlike anything he'd heard from her before. For a moment, the mask of superiority slipped, revealing the weight she carried. She wasn't just fighting to survive, she was fighting to preserve something far greater than herself. He didn't know the full story, but he didn't need to. The strain in her expression, the desperation in her tone said enough. "All right," he said, his voice softer now, "but let's be smart about it. If this thing is as advanced as you say, there's got to be a way to test it without putting up a neon sign that says, 'Come kill me.'" Her eyes met his, and for the first time, there was no condescension in her gaze. Only a reluctant kind of trust. They compromised, setting up a makeshift shield around the ship's core systems to mask its energy output. When the system hummed to life, glowing faintly with a soft, otherworldly light, Elliot couldn't help but feel a flicker of pride. Lyra's expression mirrored his, though she tried to hide it, but the relief was short-lived. As they worked to stabilize the power flow, a piercing alarm emanated from the ship, its sound alien and unnerving. Lyra's face paled, and Elliot didn't need to ask what it meant. Something or someone had detected them. The alarm cut off abruptly, replaced by a low, ominous hum that seemed to reverberate through the walls. Lyra moved quickly, her fingers dancing across the ship's controls. Elliot followed her lead, his heart pounding. "They're scanning the area," she said, her voice tight. "If they pinpoint our location, we'll handle it," Elliot interrupted, though his confidence was mostly for her benefit. His mind raced as he scanned the workshop for anything that could help. His eyes landed on an old signal jammer he'd built as a side project months ago. It wasn't designed for alien tech, but it might be enough to disrupt the scan. He grabbed the device and began modifying it with a speed born of desperation. Lyra glanced over, her expression skeptical but resigned. "That primitive contraption is going to save us. Unless you've got a better idea, Princess, I'd suggest crossing your fingers." The next few minutes were a blur of frantic adjustments and half-muttered curses. When the jammer finally powered up, Elliot held his breath. The hum of the scan grew louder, the tension in the air almost suffocating. Then, slowly, it began to fade. The silence that followed was deafening. Elliot exhaled shakily, setting the jammer down with trembling hand. Lyra stared at him, her expression unreadable. "You surprised me," she said at last, the words hesitant, almost reluctant. "Yeah, well, I surprise myself sometimes," he muttered, collapsing onto a nearby chair. The crisis averted, they returned to their work, though the atmosphere between them had shifted yet again. The mistrust that had defined their early interactions was still there, but it was tempered now by something else. Something fragile and unspoken. For the first time, Elliot wondered if they might actually stand a chance. The night had a stillness that pressed against Elliot's chest like a weight. The faint hum of Lyra's ship resonated softly in the background, a constant reminder of how close they were to finishing and how precarious their position had become. They had bought themselves time with the jammer, but both of them knew it was a temporary reprieve. Elliot could see it in Lyra's eyes whenever she glanced at the ship, urgency and fear tightly wound beneath her outward calm. Elliot sat at the workbench, his fingers working mechanically on a panel of alien wiring. Every moment spent in the quiet was a moment for his mind to wander, to dwell on how strange his life had become. He had spent so much of it believing he was just an ordinary guy with ordinary problems. And now he was here, tangled in something so much bigger than himself, fighting battles that didn't even belong to his world. Lyra approached, her presence quiet but commanding. She carried herself like someone who didn't want to admit she was afraid. He had come to know that look well. Without a word, she handed him another component for the repairs. Her gaze lingered on his hands as he worked, her expression softening for a fleeting moment before she spoke. "We're close," she said, her voice low but steady. "The core systems are stable, but the navigation matrix is still incomplete. If they find us before I can escape, they won't," Elliot interrupted, more firmly than he felt. "We've made it this far. I'm not letting anyone take you down now." Lyra tilted her head slightly, studying him. "You say that as if you have a choice in the matter." "I don't," Elliot admitted, meeting her gaze. "But if there's one thing I've learned, it's that I'm too stubborn to quit." For the first time in days, Lyra smiled, not the faint, fleeting ghost of a smile she had given before, but something genuine. It was gone in an instant, replaced by her usual stoic composure, but it was enough to give him a flicker of hope. The moment was broken by a distant rumble, a low vibration that set the tools on the bench trembling. Both of them froze. Lyra's eyes flicked toward the door, her posture shifting immediately into something taut and alert. The sound grew louder, accompanied by a faint glow seeping through the cracks in the windows. "They found us," she said, her voice tight. Elliot grabbed a wrench, the absurdity of it striking him even as he did. "What's the plan?" Lyra moved swiftly, her hands glowing faintly as she activated the ship's defensive systems. "We hold them off long enough for the final repairs. Once the navigation matrix is online, I'll launch immediately, and what happens to me?" Elliot asked, trying to sound casual even as his stomach churned. Lyra hesitated for a fraction of a second, her eyes meeting his. "We'll figure that out when we survive." Before he could respond, the first blast hit, shaking the workshop violently. Elliot stumbled, grabbing the edge of the workbench to steady himself. Outside, shadows moved in the unnatural light, their forms distorted but unmistakably hostile. The attackers didn't waste time. Another blast followed, this one shattering one of the windows and sending shards of glass across the room. Lyra moved with precision, her hands glowing brighter as she directed energy toward the ship's defensive systems. Elliot had no idea what she was doing, but the ship responded, a shimmering barrier enveloping it as the attackers advanced. He grabbed a makeshift weapon, a length of pipe, and positioned himself near the door, his heart hammering in his chest. The next few minutes were chaos. The attackers broke through the outer walls, their figures fully visible, now sleek and alien, with weapons that crackled with energy. Lyra fought them with a ferocity that left Elliot in awe, her movements fluid and precise as she deflected their attacks with bursts of light. But it wasn't enough. For every enemy she incapacitated, another seemed to take their place. Elliot didn't think he acted. He hurled tools, pipes, anything within reach, using the cluttered workshop to his advantage. One of the attackers turned toward him, its weapon aimed directly at his chest. Panic surged through him, but before the shot could land, Lyra was there, her energy shielding him from the blast. The force of it sent her staggering, but she didn't falter. "You're reckless," she said, her tone scolding even as she helped him to his feet. "You're welcome," he shot back, his grip tightening on the pipe. The battle continued, the attackers growing more relentless as the minutes dragged on. Lyra's energy was visibly waning, her movements slower, her defenses weaker. Elliot could see the exhaustion etched into her features, but she didn't stop. She couldn't, and neither could he. Finally, the ship's systems hummed to life, the navigation matrix glowing with a soft blue light. Lyra turned to Elliot, her expression fierce. "It's ready. We need to go now." Elliot hesitated, his mind racing. He had spent so much time focused on getting her ship repaired that he hadn't thought about what would happen after. The reality of her leaving hit him like a punch to the gut, but there was no time to dwell on it. The attackers were closing in, their weapons aimed at the ship. Lyra grabbed his arm, her grip firm. "Elliot, come with me." The words were simple, but they carried a weight that stopped him in his tracks. He looked at her, at the determination in her eyes, and knew she meant it. He didn't know what waited for him beyond this planet, but he knew what waited if he stayed. Death, emptiness, a life that no longer fit. All right, he said, his voice steady. Let's go. Lyra didn't waste a second. She pulled him toward the ship, the barrier shimmering as they passed through. The attackers fired relentlessly, but the ship's systems held, deflecting the blasts as Lyra activated the launch sequence. The vessel hummed louder, its energy building to a crescendo. As the ship lifted off, Elliot looked out the window, watching the world he had known shrink away. His chest tightened with a mix of fear and exhilaration. He didn't know what lay ahead, but for the first time in a long time, he felt alive. Lyra stood beside him, her expression unreadable but softer than he'd ever seen it. You made the right choice, she said quietly. Guess we'll find out, Elliot replied, a faint smile tugging at his lips. The ship shot through the atmosphere, leaving Earth behind. Together they faced the unknown, their fates bound by a fragile trust and a shared determination to survive.